Los Angeles, 1964. In a quiet hospital office, a doctor looks John Wayne in the eye and says the word no legend is supposed to hear: cancer. The treatment isn't rest. It isn't a warning. It's removal. A lung. Within days, the face of America's toughest cowboy signs papers that could end his career or end his life. And then, after the surgery, in a hallway where cameras never go, a single document lands on a nurse's desk and triggers a decision that will haunt one witness for decades. This is the story. The hospital did not look like the movies. There were no dramatic speeches, no swelling music, no crowd gathered outside the door. Just long corridors washed in pale fluorescent light, the steady hum of machines, and the quiet efficiency of people who dealt with endings for a living. John Wayne sat upright on the edge of a narrow hospital bed, his back straight out of habit more than comfort. At 57, he was already an American monument. By 1964, he wasn't just a movie star. He was the movie star, the embodiment of strength, certainty, and the kind of masculinity that didn't ask permission or forgiveness. On screen, he had survived ambushes, wars, and deserts. He had outlasted younger men and walked away from gunfights without looking back. But here, in this room, none of that mattered. The doctor spoke carefully. Not softly, carefully. Lung cancer. Advanced enough that waiting wasn't an option. Radiation alone wouldn't do it. The only real chance was surgery. Radical surgery. One lung. The words hung in the air longer than the doctor intended. Wayne didn't interrupt. He didn't joke. He didn't posture. He simply listened, eyes fixed on a spot just above the doctor's shoulder, as if staring directly at the truth might give it too much power. For most men, losing a lung was a medical crisis. For John Wayne, it was something else entirely. It was an existential threat. His entire public identity was built on physical presence, the broad frame, the deliberate walk, the voice that carried authority without raising volume. Hollywood didn't sell Wayne as vulnerable. It sold him as immovable, and Wayne knew it. Outside that hospital room was a studio system that depended on him. Producers, crews, actors, and entire productions were tied to his reliability. Inside, it was a man being asked to accept that his body would never work the same way again. He thought about the roles he still wanted to play, the contracts already signed, the people who would lose work if he couldn't show up. He thought about the rumors that would follow him if word got out. In Hollywood, weakness traveled faster than truth. What he didn't say out loud was the thing that frightened him most. He was terrified of being seen as fragile. Growing up, Wayne had learned early that strength wasn't optional. Losing his football scholarship at USC after an injury had already taught him how quickly a man could fall out of favor. He had clawed his way back through B-Western obscurity, humiliation, and years of being dismissed as expendable. He had sworn never to be that vulnerable again. Now vulnerability was unavoidable. The surgery was scheduled quickly, too quickly to second guess. Friends and associates were told he was taking some time off. No details, no interviews, no public statements, just silence. In the days before the operation, Wayne walked the hospital halls when he could, moving slower than he liked, breathing shallower than he was used to. Nurses noticed him immediately, though few spoke to him directly. Some avoided eye contact, unsure whether to treat him as a patient or a legend. One nurse, a woman who had worked oncology long enough to recognize fear even when it wore confidence like armor, watched him pass each morning. She noticed how he paused at the end of the hallway, one hand lightly touching the wall, steadying himself before turning back. He never complained. He never asked for special treatment. When the day came, Wayne signed the consent forms without hesitation. His signature was firm, controlled, the handwriting of a man refusing to let his hand betray what his face would not. As he was wheeled toward the operating room, the doors closing behind him, there was no audience, no applause, no camera flash, just a man about to lose part of himself, and a world that would never be allowed to see the cost. And while surgeons prepared to open his chest elsewhere in the same hospital, another family was quietly discovering how little their suffering mattered to anyone with power. That collision between legend and anonymity was about to define what this story was really about. The operation took hours. On the other side of those closed doors, surgeons worked in a world measured in minutes and millimeters. They cut through skin and muscle, separated ribs, and reached into the chest where breath had always been automatic. When the left lung was removed, it did not look dramatic. It looked final. In recovery, John Wayne drifted in and out of consciousness, waking to a body that felt unfamiliar. Every inhale was work now. Every exhale carried a small, private panic. The first time he tried to speak, his throat produced only a rasp, and the sound startled him more than the pain. The nurse who had watched him in the hallway was there when he opened his eyes. She didn't call him Mr. Wayne, not at first. She called him Sir, the way she addressed men who were trying not to be afraid. He looked at her with a focus that felt too sharp for a man still coming back from anesthesia. His eyes moved to the oxygen tubing, then to her face, then away, as if he couldn't bear to see sympathy there. "Is it done?" he asked. "It's done," she said. His jaw tightened, and the smallest tremor passed through his hand. He hid it by closing his fingers into a fist. There were visitors, but not in the way people imagined. Hollywood had a talent for turning concern into spectacle, and Wayne would not allow his hospital bed to become a stage. A few close associates came quietly, a family member, a representative. Conversations were kept low and brief, like everyone understood that the man in the bed was not supposed to be seen like this. In the days that followed, the world outside the hospital continued to move. Cameras flashed at premieres. Studios announced schedules. Men in suits made plans that assumed John Wayne would be back on his feet soon. Inside the hospital, time moved differently. Wayne learned how to sit up without tearing something that felt stitched together with wire. He learned the rhythm of pain medication, the moments when it dulled the edges and the moments when it didn't. He learned how quickly breath ran out now. Walking a few steps to the window could leave him fighting for air, and the fight humiliated him more than he would ever admit. The nurse watched him refuse help. She watched him insist on doing small things alone, as if each one was a referendum on whether he still deserved to be John Wayne. He didn't talk about fear. He didn't talk about death. He talked about work. "How soon?" he asked the doctor. "How soon can I get back?" The doctor gave a careful answer, the kind that protected him from lawsuits and protected Wayne from the truth. "Weeks, not days. Months, not weeks." Recovery would not be cinematic. Wayne nodded as if he agreed, but his eyes said he was already somewhere else. He was already walking onto a set. He was already under lights. In another wing of the same hospital, a different kind of silence was spreading. A man named Frank Dalton sat in a chair that had seen too many tired bodies. Frank wasn't famous. He wasn't wealthy. He didn't have assistants or studio contracts. He had a job on his feet and a wife who was trying not to cry in front of their 12-year-old daughter. Frank's wife, Eleanor, clutched a purse that was too light to carry the kind of hope she needed it to carry. Their daughter, Rosie, swung her legs nervously, eyes fixed on the pattern of the floor, as if she could stare hard enough to make it change into something else. Rosie had been admitted 2 nights earlier with a serious infection. Not a glamorous illness, not a story anyone would tell at a dinner party. Just a fast-spreading threat that required medicine they didn't have money for and time they couldn't afford to waste. A hospital administrator had spoken to them that morning, not cruelly, not kindly, neutrally. There were costs, there were forms, there were payments expected, there were numbers that didn't sound like numbers to Frank. They sounded like a verdict. Eleanor asked what families like theirs were supposed to do. The administrator gave the kind of answer systems always give when they want to sound human without changing anything. A payment plan, a charity application, some paperwork, some waiting. Frank listened and felt something inside him go numb. He had served in the Pacific as a young man. He had survived things that should have ended him. But nothing in war had prepared him for this. Watching his child fight for her life, while a stranger spoke about money like it mattered more than blood. Frank and Eleanor did not know John Wayne was in the same building. They did not know a legend was learning to breathe again a few hallways away. They were too busy learning how small they were in the face of institutions. That afternoon, the nurse who had been assigned to Wayne stepped into the administrative office with a stack of paperwork. She was efficient, steady, the kind of professional who could navigate both patient care and the machinery behind it. She placed one file on the desk, glanced at it, and froze. It was not Wayne's file. It was the Dalton account. She didn't mean to read it. It was simply there, open at the wrong moment, with a total written in dark ink, a number too large for a family like that to carry. She thought of Eleanor's face. She thought of the little girl's legs swinging like she was trying to kick away fear. She thought of Frank's blank stare, the stare of a man realizing the world didn't care what he had survived. The nurse looked down the hallway before speaking, as if the walls themselves could report her. "This one," she said quietly to the administrator. "This is the man in room 312. The little girl." The administrator didn't look up. "Yes, we have the forms for them. They don't have this kind of money." The administrator finally met her eyes. The look wasn't heartless, it was tired. Most people don't. The nurse felt anger flare and then harden into something colder. She had spent years watching suffering become paperwork. She had watched bills arrive after funerals. She had watched families fall apart in waiting rooms. But something about the Dalton account caught in her chest like a thorn. Maybe it was Rosie's age. Maybe it was the father's hands, rough from work. Maybe it was the way Eleanor tried to be polite even while drowning. Or maybe it was the fact that, in this building, a famous man was receiving the best care available, and a child was being priced like a liability. The nurse picked up the file and closed it, her voice lowered. "There has to be something we can do." The administrator exhaled slowly, the way people do when they know a conversation is dangerous. "There are policies. Policies are for people who can afford to follow them," the nurse said before she could stop herself. The administrator's mouth tightened. "Watch it." She did. She watched her tone. She watched her words, but her eyes didn't soften. "What happens if they can't pay?" she asked. The administrator leaned back. "We treat the patient. That's not the issue. The issue is what happens after." The nurse held the file like it weighed more than paper. She wanted to argue. She wanted to shout. She wanted to walk back into Rosie's room and promise them the world wasn't as cruel as it seemed. But promises didn't clear balances. She left the office and walked down the corridor, past doors that held pain, past nurses who had learned to keep moving, past a janitor who whistled softly as if trying to drown out the sadness. When she reached Wayne's room, she paused before entering. She told herself she was there to check vitals. She told herself she was there to do her job. But when she stepped inside, she saw him sitting up, alone, staring at his hands as if calculating what they could still do. He looked up when she entered. For a moment, he looked smaller than the man on posters. Not weak, just human. He could see something on her face. Wayne had spent his entire career reading people. He had faced cameras, crowds, directors, politicians. He knew when someone walked into a room carrying something heavy. "What is it?" he asked. The nurse hesitated. The safe thing was to say nothing. The professional thing was to stay in her lane. The legal thing was to keep her mouth shut. She did not do the safe thing. "There's a family," she said carefully. "In another wing, a little girl. They're scared." Wayne didn't respond immediately. His chest rose and fell with effort. The oxygen hissed softly, like a reminder that he had limits now. "What's wrong with her?" he asked. "Infection," the nurse said. "She'll be fine if the medicine works. But the bill is more than they make in a year." Wayne's eyes narrowed, not in confusion, but in focus, the way they did in his films right before he decided what kind of man he was going to be in the next 10 seconds. The nurse felt her own pulse quicken. She hadn't planned to tell him the amount. She hadn't planned to pull him into her anger. She hadn't even planned to say "bill" out loud. But now it was said. Now it existed between them. Wayne looked away toward the window. Outside, the city was moving. People were living ordinary lives. Somewhere, a studio executive was probably laughing at lunch. They did on paper. Filming was scheduled cautiously at first. Short days, limited movement, chairs placed just out of frame so he could sit between takes. No one said the word lung. No one said the word weak. Hollywood had always been fluent in denial. On his first day back on set, Wayne walked slower than usual. The familiar weight of wardrobe felt heavier now. Lights burned hotter. The air on the soundstage seemed thinner, like it was rationed. A younger actor watched him from across the set, whispering to a crew member. Wayne caught it. He always did. The glance, the calculation, the unspoken question of whether the old man still had it. Wayne said nothing. He adjusted his stance, planted his feet, lifted his chin. When the camera rolled, he delivered the line without rushing it, voice steady but measured. He did not overpower the moment. He let it breathe. Ironically, that restraint made it stronger. Between takes, he turned away from the crowd and leaned lightly against the set wall, just long enough to recover. The nurse's words came back to him then, uninvited. They don't need to thank me. They need to breathe. He thought of the little girl he would never meet, of the envelope that left his room without his name, of the way that decision had felt more honest than any role he had ever played. Midway through the day, the limits arrived without warning. A scene called for him to cross the set, deliver a confrontation, and turn sharply toward the camera. It was nothing by old standards. He had done far worse with broken bones and fevers. This time, halfway through the movement, his chest tightened. Not pain, pressure. The air didn't come when he expected it to. His vision narrowed, the edges of the set blurring like a lens going out of focus. For a split second, the legend slipped, and what stood there was a man negotiating with his own body. The director started to call cut. Wayne lifted a hand, not dramatically, not angrily, just enough. "Give me a second," he said. The set went silent. Crew members froze, unsure where to look. The younger actor shifted his weight, suddenly aware that he was witnessing something that didn't belong to him. Wayne stood still, eyes closed, counting breaths the way he had learned to do alone at night. In, out, slower. Control was everything. When he opened his eyes, they were clear. "Roll it," he said. The director hesitated, then nodded. Wayne finished the scene. Not perfectly, not powerfully in the old way, but truthfully. When it was over, no one applauded. They didn't need to. Something more important had happened. That night, alone again, Wayne sat in a chair by the window, city lights stretching below him. He placed a hand on his chest, feeling the uneven rise and fall, and allowed himself one thought he would never say out loud. Surviving had taken courage, but staying invisible when it mattered most, that had taken something else entirely. And the cost of that choice was only beginning to reveal itself. In the months after the surgery, John Wayne became two men at once. There was the man the public saw, the familiar silhouette, the steady voice, the confident stride carefully rebuilt step by step. And there was the man only a handful of people knew, someone who measured his days in breaths and planned every movement like it mattered, because now it did. Hollywood helped him hide it. That was what Hollywood was good at. Scenes were rewritten without announcing why. Blocking was adjusted so he could sit or lean without looking like he needed to. Costumes were tailored to conceal the subtle weight changes that came with recovery. Editors trimmed seconds where his breathing looked heavy. The machine protected the myth because the myth was profitable. But the people closest to him noticed the difference. Wayne became quieter in certain moments. Not kinder in the sentimental way people like to imagine, but more precise, more deliberate. Like a man who understood that time wasn't unlimited and that words had to earn their place. When he laughed, it didn't last as long. When he walked into a room, he still filled it, but there was a new awareness in his eyes, as if he was taking inventory. Who was working too hard? Who looked tired? Who carried something they weren't saying? And once you see that kind of weight in other people, it's difficult to ignore it. The nurse never told anyone the details. Not because she was afraid, but because she understood the rule Wayne had given her. No names. She watched the Dalton family leave the hospital days later. Eleanor cried when the doctor said Rosie would be fine. Frank didn't cry. He simply held his daughter's hand like he'd been waiting his whole life to touch something that mattered more than war, more than pride, more than money. They asked the nurse questions. Who did this? Why would someone do this? The nurse gave them the only answer she could. Someone who didn't want you to owe him anything. Frank stared at her for a long moment, the way men do when they're trying to decide whether the world is still worth trusting. Then he nodded once, and that was all. Years passed. Wayne returned fully to work. He made films. He fought battles on screen. He played heroes the country wanted to believe in. And when people spoke about him surviving cancer, they framed it as toughness, as if grit alone had cut the tumor out of his chest. They didn't understand what surviving actually required. It required humiliation, breathlessness, the private terror of waking in the night and wondering if the next inhale would arrive on time. It required accepting that strength was no longer a performance you could rely on. It had to be a choice you made again and again. And the strange part was this: Wayne's myth did not crack because of illness. It hardened. Not because he was invincible, but because he refused to let suffering make him smaller. He adjusted. He adapted. He returned. In a culture that worshipped endless power, he created the illusion of endless power while living with the reality that it was finite. But the real lesson of that year wasn't the surgery, it was the envelope. Because that single act exposed something most people never want to admit. Fame doesn't automatically make a man good, and goodness doesn't require an audience. Wayne could have turned charity into headlines. He could have insisted on being thanked. He could have used the moment as proof that he was exactly who the posters claimed. Instead, he chose invisibility. He chose to do something that mattered and then vanish from it. That choice revealed the difference between pride and principle. Pride needs witnesses. Principle doesn't. The nurse understood this better than anyone. She continued working in that hospital, watching rich patients demand special treatment and watching ordinary families break under the weight of bills that looked like punishment. She saw men who were powerful in public become helpless in private. She saw people beg for dignity and settle for survival. And sometimes when a patient asked her if anyone famous was in the building, she thought of Wayne sitting upright on that bed, refusing sympathy, signing his name like it was a weapon, then giving her the one order that made the whole thing real. No names. It was not a line designed for a movie. It was too simple for that. But it was the kind of line a man says when he is trying to live up to something inside himself, not something outside. That's what made it linger. Because long after the lights go out and the credits roll, the people who truly change lives are often the ones you never see. And that is exactly why stories like this matter now more than ever. John Wayne lived long enough to see his legend become permanent. Statues were built, airports were named, his image was frozen in time as the unbreakable man who never backed down. That was the version people remembered because it was easier to admire strength than to understand it. But the truth is quieter. The man behind the myth was not defined by the roles he played after 1964 or by how many films he completed with one lung. He was defined by a moment no camera captured when he chose to use what power he had without asking for credit, applause, or forgiveness. Strength, in the end, was not about surviving cancer. It was about what he did while surviving it. It was about understanding that dignity doesn't come from being seen as strong, but from refusing to let suffering turn you inward. It was about recognizing another person's fear and deciding that anonymity was a small price to pay for relief. Today, we celebrate generosity when it trends. We reward kindness when it's visible. But the kind of character that built legends was often invisible by design. So ask yourself this: if you had the chance to change someone's life and never be thanked for it, would you still do it? If this story made you think, share it. Leave a comment. And if you want more stories about the men behind the myths, subscribe. Because whether we admit it or not, they don't make men like John Wayne anymore.